Over the past year, mainly due to the war in Ukraine, you may have heard a lot about this thing called NATO. In this video, we're going to go over what exactly NATO is, how it came to be, and the military and geopolitical role it's played over all the years. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance established via the North Atlantic Treaty of April 4th, 1949. Its aims were to counterbalance the Soviet armies that were stationed in Central and Eastern Europe after World War II. Original members of NATO include the 12 countries that you can see on screen. As time went on, more countries have been added, with North Macedonia being the... Sorry, is North Macedonia pronounced North Macedonia or North Macedonia?
Macedonia.
Okay. As time went on, more countries have been added, with North Macedonia being the latest addition in 2020. And in 2022, as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Sweden and Finland announced their intention to join. The North Atlantic Treaty had various articles, which you can think of as agreements between the NATO members. The most notable include Article 5, which compels the NATO countries to defend themselves and each other, including the use of armed force if an armed attack occurs. In simpler terms, if you invade a NATO country, you aren't only at war with the country you invaded, but you will be at war with all NATO countries. Article 6 also defines the geographic scope of the treaty as covering any territory of any of the members in Europe or North America. Other articles commit the allies to strengthening democratic institutions, building military capabilities, consulting each other, and remaining open to inviting other European states to join. Although I've listed a few things that may seem standard as part of any military alliance, a lot of these are very loaded and have had far-reaching consequences to this day, especially when considering the tensions between Eastern Europe and the West. I won't be going into these today, but if you would like to see a video going into this more, please let us know in the comments. So now that we've established what NATO is, let's explore how it began. After World War II, Western Europe was in shambles. It was economically and militarily exhausted, with the Western allies having a drastically reduced armed force. New powerful communist parties had also arisen in France and Italy. This was another headache for the West on top of the looming threat of the Soviet Union in the East. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war with armies dominating all states of Central and Eastern Europe, and by 1948, communists had consolidated power and control of governments in those countries and suppressed all non-communist political activity. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister during the war years, described this as an iron curtain that had descended across Europe. At this point, wartime cooperation between the Allies and the Soviets had completely broken down, and Germany had been split between the democratic West and the communist East. In a response to the dire situation in Europe, the US spearheaded the Marshall Plan in 1948 to infuse economic aid to Western and Southern European countries on the condition that they cooperate with each other and engage in joint planning to speed mutual recovery. Prior to NATO, there was also the Brussels Treaty of 1948 between the UK, France, and the Low Countries, which agreed on a collective defense agreement called the Western European Union. However, it was soon concluded that a more formidable defense alliance was needed to counteract the Soviets. By this time, Britain, Canada, and the US were already having secret talks for the formation of an alternative to the United Nations, which was becoming incapacitated by the Cold War at this point. And in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was agreed and NATO was formed. A serious issue for NATO in the 1950s was the negotiation of West Germany's participation in the alliance. Understandably, there was hesitancy to see a re-armed Germany, lest we see history repeat itself. But the country's strength was recognized as necessary to protect Western Europe from a Soviet invasion. Arrangements were made for Germany's safe participation in the alliance as part of the 1954 Paris Agreements. This ended the occupation of West Germany by the Allies. In May 1955, West Germany joined NATO. This prompted the Soviet Union to respond by forming the Warsaw Pact in Central and Eastern Europe in the same year. West Germany was able to contribute many military divisions and substantial forces to NATO, and by the time the Cold War ended, nearly 1 million troops were stationed in Germany, although not all of them were from Germany. Not everything has been sunshine and rainbows between the NATO allies. France have had a rocky relationship with NATO over the years. After 1958, Presidents Charles de Gaulle, I hope that's how you pronounce his name, increasingly criticized the organization for its dominion by the US and its intrusion on French sovereignty. He argued that NATO integration subjected France to automatic war at the decision of foreigners. Fair point. This led to France withdrawing from the military command structure of NATO, in 1966. This then required NATO to move headquarters from France to Brussels. Despite this, France still maintained a liaison relationship with NATO's Integrated Military Command, continued to sit on the council, and maintained and deployed ground forces in West Germany, although this was under new agreements with West Germany and not under NATO jurisdiction. However, France rejoined the military command structure of NATO in 2009. Again, this is another loaded topic with whether France left NATO or whether they didn't, that we can tackle in more detail in a separate video. But from my research, it looks like they essentially altered their role and autonomy in and out of NATO, especially relating to the military command structure of the organization. From the start, NATO's primary aim was to unify and strengthen the West's response to a possible invasion by the Soviet Union and its allies. Early in the 1950s, NATO relied partly on the threat of massive nuclear retaliation from the US to counteract the Warsaw Pact's much larger ground forces, and starting in 1957, this policy was aided by the deployment of American nuclear weapons in European bases. NATO later took on a flexible response strategy, which the US interpreted to mean that war in Europe did not have to lead to an all-out nuclear war. Under this strategy, many Allied forces were equipped with American battlefield and theater nuclear weapons, but with dual control, allowing both the host country and the US to veto their use. Britain, however, kept control of its strategic nukes, but brought it within NATO's planning structures, while France's nuclear forces remained completely autonomous. A conventional and nuclear stalemate between the East and the West continued through the construction of the Berlin Wall in the 60s, Detente in the 70s, which was a period of easing tensions between the sides, and the resurgence of tensions in the 80s when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the election of Ronald Reagan as president in the US. After 1985, however, economic and political reforms by Mikhail Gorbachev fundamentally changed things. Gorbachev announced that Moscow would no longer prop up communist governments in Central and Eastern Europe. This greatly reduced the threat that the Warsaw Pact had formerly posed to the West. The reunification of Germany in 1990 and its retention of NATO membership created a need and an opportunity for NATO to be transformed into more of a political alliance focused on maintaining international stability in Europe. Once the Cold War was over, NATO was reconceived as a cooperative security organization with two main objectives. The first was to foster dialogue and cooperation with former adversaries in the Warsaw Pact. This took the form of establishing partnerships with former adversaries to provide a space for the exchange of political and security views. The second objective was to manage conflicts in areas in the European periphery, such as the Balkans. This was exemplified by NATO's first use of military force when it entered the war in Bosnia. Bro, how do you even say that country's name, man? This was exemplified by NATO's first use of military force when it entered the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think I got it. During the presidency of Bill Clinton, the US also led an initiative to enlarge NATO membership gradually to include former Soviet allies. There were different views on whether this was the right thing to do or the wrong move, with many believing that the decisions here were made to have long-lasting ramifications that could be felt today. Supporters argued that this was the best, as the West could then begin integrating these states into regional political and economic institutions, such as the EU. Some feared that Russian aggression might take place and believed that NATO membership would guarantee freedom for newly democratic regimes. However, opponents argued against this move, citing enormous costs of modernizing military forces of new members, and also argued that Russia would feel provoked by this and would hinder democracy there. Regardless, more countries joined throughout the years, and in the early 2000s, NATO and Russia had actually formed a strategic relationship to address common concerns such as international terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and arms control. Events following 9/11 also led to a new dynamic within the alliance that increasingly favored military engagement of new members outside of Europe, initially with a mission against the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2003, and then with air operations against the Gaddafi regime in Libya in early 2011. The strategic bond between Russia and NATO was eventually shaken due to regional aggression by Russia in invading Georgia in 2008. As a result, NATO and Georgia would establish the NATO-Georgia Commission to help Georgia achieve its goal of NATO membership. In 2014, also, a pro-Russian Ukrainian president called Viktor Yanukovych fled Ukraine after months of Ukrainian protests, and Russia responded by invading and annexing Crimea and stirring uprisings in Ukraine's Donbass region. This brings us to present day today, where in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine after beginning a massive military buildup along Ukraine's borders. And here we are today. As always, I hope you found this video interesting and informative. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you in the next one.